I was 26 when I learned how to keep peace by disappearing, and at the time I called it maturity. Daniel and I had been married 4 years, living over a hardware store where the floor leaned toward the kitchen and every passing truck made the glasses click in the cabinet. We were short on money and long on pride. He worked all day, I worked part-time, and kept the apartment running, and both of us wanted to look like capable adults. I decided very early that a good wife did not make things harder. The first thing I swallowed was small enough to look harmless. I had saved for a blue dress for a church dinner, and Daniel used the cash envelope by mistake to pay the electric bill. He apologized quickly, already reaching for his keys, and I said, "It's okay, we needed the lights more." It was practical, it was also not true. I was disappointed and wanted him to know it. Instead, I smiled and put my hurt away because I thought naming it would make me petty. That became my method. If his mother made a cutting joke, I laughed. If he interrupted me, I let it go. If something stung, I cleaned the kitchen harder and told myself I was being strong. Daniel was not cruel, but he was straightforward. When I said I was fine, he believed me. I blamed him for not reading me better while I kept handing him the wrong map. What I believed then was simple: speaking up creates problems. What I understand now is that silence creates problems too, only slower. In my family, women who swallowed things were praised for being steady, and women who spoke plainly were called difficult. I wanted to be praised. I wanted peace more than I wanted to be known, and I did not realize those two wants would eventually turn against each other. By the time Elise was born, I could move through a whole day with a calm face and a tight chest. I thought I was preserving love. I did not know I was teaching my marriage to live around my truth instead of with it. When I look back now, I can still see that blue dress in my mind, unworn and hanging in the store window. It was never really about the dress. It was the first price I paid to stay agreeable, and I kept paying in bigger amounts after that. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. Motherhood gave me endless excuses to stay quiet, and I used all of them. There were bottles, fevers, laundry, groceries, church, and never enough sleep. By the time Patrick was born, I could move through the house on instinct, one hand stirring soup while the other wiped a nose or folded a towel. I looked competent. Inside, I felt stretched thin and unseen, but I almost never said that sentence out loud. My silence did not always look like silence. Sometimes it looked like efficiency. Daniel would ask, "What's wrong?" And I would answer, "Nothing," in a tone that told him everything and nothing at once. He would take me at my word and move on to talking about work, and I would feel abandoned by a conversation I refused to have. At night, I replayed little moments and built a quiet case against him in my head. He did not know he was in court. I was judge, jury, and wounded witness all by myself. I remember one evening when Elise was coughing, Patrick would not settle, and I had slept maybe 3 hours the night before. Daniel came in, looked around the messy kitchen, and said gently, "Rough day?" I said, "I'm handling it," because what I wanted sounded too needy in my own ears. I wanted him to take over, to tell me to sit, to notice I was near tears. He changed his shirt and started sorting the mail, and I cried in the pantry, with the door half closed so nobody would hear. That was the shape of those years. Need buried under competence. I thought asking directly would make me weak. Worse, I thought if I asked and still didn't get what I needed, I would have to face how lonely I felt. Silence let me postpone that truth. It also made loneliness feel noble, which is a dangerous lie. What I understand now is that silence trains a relationship. Every time I hit a hurt, I taught Daniel to move past it. Every time I said, "I'm fine," I widened the distance and then blamed him for the room between us. I was not trying to deceive him, but I was withholding the one thing he actually needed to respond well: the truth. The children were little, and I kept saying there would be time later. Later came, but the habits came with it. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. The cost showed up slowly, not as one terrible fight, but as a thinning of warmth. By my late 30s, Daniel and I ran the household like a machine. Bills got paid, meals were made, church clothes were ironed, birthdays were remembered. From the outside, we looked dependable. Inside, I often felt like a capable employee in my own marriage. Elise was the first one to name it. She was 13, doing homework at the kitchen counter while I chopped onions for supper. Daniel was in the den, listening to the news. Without looking up, she asked, "Why do you always sound mad when you say you're not mad?" I laughed because I did not know what else to do. She shrugged and said, "Dad always looks confused." Then she went back to algebra, like she had not just told me the exact truth. She had. I communicated in weather instead of words. I sighed while washing dishes. I answered with short sentences. I banged drawers just enough to be heard, but not enough to be called out. I told myself I was controlling my temper, but really I was making everyone guess. Then I resented them for guessing wrong. A few months later, I was on my sister Ruth's porch shelling peas and finally admitted I felt lonely. She listened and let me go on for a while. I talked about Daniel's tone, his timing, his blind spots, all of it. Then she asked one question that made me furious because it was so plain. "What do you say when you're hurt?" I started explaining context. She interrupted me and said, "No, what words do you say?" I had no answer. I could list dozens of injuries and could not name the last time I had said, clearly and calmly, "That hurt me," or "I need you right now," or "I'm upset and I want to talk," before this hardens. I had built my whole identity around being easy to live with. Speaking plainly felt like betrayal. That afternoon, with pea shells piling in my lap, I saw another cost of never speaking up. After enough years, you stop trusting your own voice. You still feel everything, you just stop believing you're allowed to say it. That was a lonely realization, and also the first honest one. I was hidden from Daniel, but I was also hidden from myself. Seeing that did not fix anything yet, but it finally gave me the right problem. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I did not change overnight. Seeing a pattern and breaking it are different jobs, and I was still better at seeing than changing. The old habits stayed in my body. I could feel the truth rise and still choose quiet because quiet felt safer. But once I recognized the pattern, every nothing I said sounded false even to me. The real turn came when my father died. Our relationship had been difficult, and grief made everything raw and uneven. I spent 2 days helping my mother with funeral details, greeting relatives, and acting composed because someone had to. When Daniel and I got home, he carried my bag into the bedroom and asked if I wanted tea. I said no, though I did. He sat down and turned on the news. I stood in the kitchen looking at the kettle and felt a wave of anger rise so fast it scared me. I almost did what I always did: washed a dish, swallowed the feeling, and punished him with distance. Instead, I walked into the living room and said the truest, awkward sentence I had spoken in years. I said, "I know you asked, but I do want tea, and I need you to ask me again how I am because I'm not okay." The room went still. He looked surprised, then embarrassed, then relieved. He stood up immediately and said, "Okay, I'm sorry. How are you?" It was not a perfect scene. He said the words stiffly. I cried hard and answered in pieces, but he stayed with me. He made the tea. He sat through the crying. He did not fix it, but he was there, and I felt something crack open in me. Not grief. Grief was already open. I mean possibility. Later that night, I told him something I had never said in 20 years of marriage. I said, "I stay quiet because I'm afraid if I ask directly and you miss me anyway, it will hurt worse." He looked at me for a long time and said, "I thought being left alone was what you wanted when you were upset." We had been living in the same house with opposite maps. That was when I understood the deepest cost of silence. It had protected me from some immediate discomfort, yes, but it had also blocked care. Some care was available all along, and my fear kept me from receiving it. That realization hurt, but it also gave me something hope had not given me in years: a direction. I could not get back the old years, but I could stop spending new ones the same way. For the first time, being clear felt more honest than being agreeable. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. Once I started speaking up, I learned another truth quickly. Some people were comfortable with my silence. Daniel was not the only one who had grown used to me swallowing things. My mother expected me to absorb criticism without response. Women at church volunteered me for tasks because I never minded. Even my children, who loved me, assumed I could rearrange my day because I usually did. Using my voice at first felt clumsy. I over-explained everything. I apologized before I made a request, and after I made it, I would say, "I'm sorry, I know this sounds silly, but I can't host this year," and then carry guilt for 3 days. Still, I kept trying because I had finally seen the bill I had been paying. I was tired all the time, and not just from work. Performing ease is tiring. Daniel and I had our roughest stretch in my early 50s, when I stopped hinting and started saying things plainly. I told him when jokes embarrassed me. I told him when I wanted comfort instead of solutions. I told him when he walked away too soon from a hard conversation. He did not always receive it well. Sometimes he said I had gotten more sensitive. Sometimes I said it with too much edge, and he shut down. We both stumbled, but the arguments changed shape. They were louder sometimes, but cleaner. I was no longer carrying 12 old hurts into one new conversation and expecting him to know which one I meant. One winter evening, we were arguing about money, and I felt the old urge to go quiet and punish him with distance. Instead, I heard myself say, I want to shut down right now because I'm scared this won't go well, but I'm still upset. He looked at me a long time and said, I don't know what to do with that, but stay. That one word changed the room. Stay. It was simple, but it was a different marriage than the one we started with. Not easier, truer. What I believed when I was young was that speaking up would cost me closeness. What I understand now is that never speaking up had already cost me a false closeness, the kind built on performance and guesswork. Real closeness was noisier at first, but it had more oxygen in it. I had to be less easy before I could be more known. That felt risky, but it was worth the risk. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. The clearest proof came during Daniel's stroke. He was 61, out in the yard, when his speech went strange and his face changed. By the time we got to the emergency room, I was in my old role before I even noticed it. Calm voice, organized purse, questions answered, forms signed. Nurses like women like I was then. We look useful. Inside, I was terrified enough to shake. When the doctor finally left and the room quieted, Daniel reached for my hand. I could feel the old instinct rise in me like muscle memory. Be steady. Don't burden him. Don't say you're scared. I almost followed it. Then I remembered the years I had lost doing exactly that, and I chose a different sentence. I said, I'm very scared right now, and I'm trying not to act like I'm not. He looked at me with one eye still heavy and said slowly, Me too. It was a broken sentence, but it was enough. Because I had spoken, we were in the same fear instead of separate ones. That changed the whole recovery. I told the children when I needed help instead of hinting and hoping. I told church friends what I could do and what I could not. I told Daniel when I was exhausted and needed him not to correct how I packed his pillbox. Some people stepped in beautifully. A few backed away when I stopped being endlessly available. That was painful, but it was clarifying. I realized then that the cost of silence had never only been emotional, it had been practical. I had spent years overcommitting, overfunctioning, and quietly resenting people for believing me when I said yes. Speaking up gave me back time, energy, and dignity, though it also cost me the reputation of being so easy. Easy was expensive. Honest was cheaper in the long run. One afternoon, months into therapy, Daniel snapped at me in the car. The old freeze flashed through me. Then I heard myself say, Don't talk to me like I'm your enemy. He breathed hard, stared out the window, and finally said, I'm scared and mad, not at you. 10 years earlier, that moment would have spoiled a week. That day, it took 5 minutes. Speaking up did not remove pain. It shortened the distance after pain, and that changed everything. I wish I had known that when the children were small, and I thought silence was helping us survive. Still, learning it late was better than never learning it at all. The house became easier to live in once the truth had a door. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. In my late 60s, younger women started pulling me aside after church or in grocery store aisles, usually with practical questions on their faces and a different question underneath. They would ask about marriage, caregiving, or hard conversations, and I could hear my younger self in their voices. They wanted to know how to tell the truth without blowing up a life. I never gave them polished advice because polished advice had not helped me. I told them stories. I told them about crying in the pantry while saying, "I'm handling it." I told them about the blue dress money and the years I called myself strong because I could swallow disappointment quietly. I told them I spent half my marriage wanting to be understood while refusing to be clear. One Sunday, a woman, maybe 35, stopped me near the coat rack, eyes red, hands shaking a little. She said, "My husband says I never tell him what I need, but when I try, I get emotional and shut down." I asked her, "What happens in your body right before you go quiet?" She blinked at me and said, "My chest gets tight." I said, "Then start there. Say, 'My chest is getting tight and I don't want to shut down.' That counts as speaking up." She wrote it on the back of a church bulletin. That is something I learned very late. Speaking up does not have to sound polished or calm to be real. Sometimes it sounds like, "I need a minute." Sometimes it sounds like, "Start over." Sometimes it sounds like, "I'm angry and I don't know how to say it kindly yet." Truth does not arrive as a speech. Sometimes it comes in one plain sentence that keeps a door from closing. Daniel used to say toward the end that I had become harder to guess and easier to know. It was a clumsy compliment, and I loved it. We both knew what he meant. I had stopped making him read weather and started giving him words. That change did not make us perfect. It made us real, and real was a better bargain than peaceful pretending. The cost of never speaking up was years of quiet distance. The benefit of learning, even late, was not a perfect marriage, but a truthful one. Truthful lasted longer than quiet ever did. By then, I did not need everyone to like my voice. I only needed to recognize it as mine and use it with care. That is a steadier kind of strength than the one I was taught. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I am 73 now, and Daniel has been gone a few years. Most mornings I stand at the kitchen sink with coffee and look at the maple tree in the yard while the house wakes up slowly around me. The quiet I live in now is different from the quiet I lived in when I was young. This quiet is not made of swallowed words. It is made of a life where I finally learned to say things as they are. When people ask what I regret, I do not say marriage or motherhood. I do not say my life was wrong. It was a good life, and I am grateful for more of it than I can count. But I do regret how long I confused silence with kindness. I regret how many evenings I spent angry in the same room with someone who would have listened if I had spoken clearly enough for him to hear me. I regret the comfort I missed because I would not name my need. I also know regret is only useful if it sharpens your honesty now. So, with my children and grandchildren, I try to spend my words differently. If I am tired, I say I am tired. If I can't help, I say no without dressing it in four apologies. If something hurts, I say it before it hardens into a story about what somebody must have meant. The cost of never speaking up was not only what I lost in relationships, It was who I became while losing it: careful, useful, and lonely, calling myself strong because I did not know what else to call it. Learning to speak, even late, made me visible to my own life again. That has been one of the deepest reliefs of growing older. Last week, Elise sat at the same table and asked if she talks too much when she is upset. I laughed because she is my daughter, and she absolutely does. Then I told her what I wish someone had told me at 26. I said, talking too much can be edited. Saying nothing leaves people guessing, and guessing is where love gets tired. She wrote it down on a napkin before she left. That made me smile after the door closed. Maybe that is how the old cost gets repaid, a little at a time. You do not get your younger years back. You hand better language to the people who come after you. I learned late, but late was still in time. I know that now, and I say it out loud. I say it because I still need to hear it myself sometimes. Speaking up did not make me less loving. It made my love easier to recognize. For me, that has been a quiet kind of grace. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me. I can hear now what silence was costing me.